The first time I saw my father in 16 years. He smiled like he had already won. He sat at the head of the conference table inside my Aunt Evelyn's lawyer's office, wearing an expensive charcoal suit, tapping his fingers with complete confidence while everyone else waited in uneasy silence. The moment I stepped through the door, his eyes swept over me with the same cold judgment I remembered from childhood. Then he smirked and said I was late, adding that I still had a talent for making everything about myself. He expected me to shrink the way I had when I was 14. Instead, I quietly took my seat across from him. That was when the lawyer walked to the door, locked it, and calmly announced that nobody would leave until a serious legal issue had been addressed. For the first time all morning, my father stopped smiling. The room smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a setting my aunt would have hated. Evelyn never believed in fake sympathy or family members who only appeared when money was involved. Yet here they all were, gathered around the table pretending to mourn while secretly wondering who would receive what. My father, Daniel Carter, stood beside my mother, Linda, acting as though the estate naturally belonged to him. One of my cousins whispered that he had not expected me to come. My father laughed and replied that Aunt Evelyn had always enjoyed rescuing hopeless causes. His words no longer hurt the way they once had. They simply reminded me why I had survived without him. Everything changed 16 years earlier on a rainy evening when my parents abandoned me on Aunt Evelyn's front porch with one duffel bag and a backpack full of every document proving I existed. My father never bothered to leave the car. My mother stood beside me under an umbrella while rain soaked my clothes. I begged them to explain what I had done wrong, but she avoided my eyes. My father rolled down his window just enough to tell me I had searched through things that were none of my business. I had only discovered that the savings account my grandmother promised for my future had suddenly been emptied. Instead of answering my questions, they left me standing there as if I were nothing more than unwanted luggage. Before I could even process what had happened, Aunt Evelyn opened the front door. She looked from my bags to my parents without saying a word. Then she picked up my backpack and found my birth certificate, school records, medical information, and a bank statement showing the account balance had fallen to zero. She stared at the paper for several seconds before looking back toward the street, but my parents were already driving away. That night she made me hot tea, prepared the guest room, and promised I would never be forced to leave unless I chose to. It was the first time in months anyone had made me feel safe. Later that night I woke to the sound of Aunt Evelyn arguing on the phone. Even from my bedroom I could hear my father's sharp voice warning her to stay out of his finances unless she wanted people digging into hers. When she returned to check on me, I noticed something I had never seen before. She looked frightened. That confused me because Evelyn was one of the strongest people I had ever known. By morning she had already enrolled me in a new school and hired a family attorney. But I could not stop thinking about that conversation. If someone as fearless as my aunt feared my father, then there had to be something much bigger hidden beneath the surface. Over the next several years, Aunt Evelyn became everything my parents never were. She encouraged me to study hard, taught me how to handle difficult conversations without losing my composure, and reminded me every day that being rejected by someone else never determined my worth. By the time I turned 18, I was helping organize the charity foundation she had built from the ground up. During our annual fundraising gala, I proudly stood beside her greeting guests until my parents walked into the ballroom without an invitation. My father instantly transformed into the perfect family man. He shook hands with wealthy donors, smiled for photographs, and loudly announced how grateful he was that I had finally recovered from my troubled teenage years. He wanted everyone to believe I had simply been a difficult child who needed discipline. Before I could respond, Aunt Evelyn stepped onto the stage, thanked everyone for supporting the foundation, and announced that the newest scholarship would carry my grandmother's name because every child deserved the future their family intended for them. The room filled with applause, but I watched my father's smile slowly disappear. Later that evening I accidentally overheard him cornering Aunt Evelyn in a hallway behind the ballroom. His voice was quiet but threatening. He warned her that if she continued hinting he had stolen money, he would expose financial records connected to a loan carrying her signature. After he walked away, I realized this was not simply about family pride. He was blackmailing her with paperwork. From that moment forward I started paying attention to every unusual document, every strange conversation, and every file Aunt Evelyn quietly locked away. Whenever I asked questions, She simply smiled and reminded me that truth meant very little unless it came with undeniable proof. Years passed before I finally understood what she meant. During her final weeks in hospice, Aunt Evelyn grew weaker every day, yet she repeatedly asked me to keep certain files safe. I assumed she was simply organizing her affairs, never imagining she was preparing for one last battle. Then she passed away, and the family gathered for the reading of her will. My father arrived carrying what he claimed was a newly signed amendment giving him access to a large portion of her estate along with her private records. He acted as though victory was already guaranteed. The lawyer slowly opened a sealed envelope Aunt Evelyn had addressed to me. Inside rested a small brass key, several account numbers, and one handwritten sentence that instantly sent chills through my body. It read, "When he comes looking for the papers, make sure he asks in front of witnesses." I looked across the table at my father, who was watching every movement with growing impatience. For the first time since entering the room, I realized Aunt Evelyn had anticipated this exact moment years before it happened. And whatever waited behind that brass key was about to destroy the carefully built lie my father had lived behind for nearly 2 decades. The lawyer led everyone into a secure archive room connected to his office. The atmosphere had completely changed. Only minutes earlier my father had looked relaxed and confident. Now he followed behind us with stiff shoulders and nervous eyes, watching the brass key in my hand as though it were the most dangerous object in the building. Mr. Harrison unlocked the outer door, then nodded for me to use the key Aunt Evelyn had left behind. My hands trembled as I slid it into the cabinet lock. The door clicked open, revealing several thick binders, a fireproof pouch, and another envelope with my aunt's handwriting across the front. My father took one uneasy step forward before the lawyer firmly instructed him to stay where he was. The first binder contained records from my grandmother's savings account. The second held loan agreements connected to my father. The third was filled with years of emails, handwritten notes, phone records, and correspondence carefully organized by date. My father tried to dismiss everything as private family paperwork, but the lawyer calmly explained that these documents were now part of the estate and directly related to the validity of the will. Every page seemed to answer a question that had haunted me since childhood. Aunt Evelyn had not been collecting random files. She had been quietly building a complete record of the truth, waiting until the evidence was impossible for anyone to deny. The first revelation struck like a punch to the chest. My grandmother had indeed created a savings account for my education, future home, and emergencies. Years before I ever discovered the account, my father had emptied nearly every dollar to cover payments on a failing business venture he had secretly financed. The money had never disappeared by accident, he had taken it himself. Even worse, the records showed that when I questioned the missing funds at 14, he realized I was dangerously close to uncovering everything. Rather than explain his actions, he abandoned me before I could ask anyone else for answers. The next binder exposed something even darker. My father had secured his business loan by using Aunt Evelyn as the guarantor, but she had never agreed to it. The signature on the paperwork was forged. Mr. Harrison placed authentic examples of her handwriting beside the loan documents, and the differences became obvious immediately. The letters were shaped differently, the spacing was inconsistent, and the pressure of the pen did not match. Professional handwriting reports included in the file confirmed the same conclusion. My father had forged her name, stolen my inheritance to keep the loan alive, and then spent years threatening Aunt Evelyn into silence by convincing her he could drag both of them into a legal disaster if she spoke too soon. My mother collapsed into a chair, staring at the evidence with tears streaming down her face. She whispered that it could not be true and begged my father to deny it, but he remained completely silent. His silence spoke louder than any confession ever could. Mr. Harrison then opened the final envelope left by Aunt Evelyn and began reading her letter aloud. She explained that my father had repeatedly threatened to accuse her of participating in the fraud if she exposed him before gathering undeniable proof. He also promised to challenge my guardianship in court, claiming I was emotionally unstable if she tried to protect me without evidence strong enough to survive his lies. She had stayed patient, documenting everything until the truth could stand on its own. The lawyer continued turning pages. There were copies of canceled checks, security camera records, nursing logs from Aunt Evelyn's final weeks, and witness statements proving my father had never visited her on the day he claimed she signed the new amendment to her will. His so-called final document was nothing more than another forgery. It was never about inheriting money. He wanted access to the archive because he knew the evidence hidden inside could destroy him forever. The moment that realization spread through the room, every relative looked at him differently. The confident businessman they admired suddenly looked like a frightened man trapped by his own lies. I reached into my purse and carefully removed a single burned loan notice sealed inside a protective sleeve. Years earlier, I had found Aunt Evelyn destroying old financial papers in her fireplace. But before the flames consumed everything, I quietly rescued one damaged page. It carried my father's genuine signature. When I placed it beside the forged loan documents, his face turned completely pale. For the first time in my life, I saw fear replace arrogance in his eyes. He understood there was no argument left to make. The evidence came from banks, lawyers, security systems, and his own handwriting. No amount of charm could erase it. Mr. Harrison officially concluded the reading of the will. Aunt Evelyn had left my parents absolutely nothing. I inherited her townhouse, her investments, and full control of the scholarship foundation created in my grandmother's honor. The forged amendment would immediately be delivered to the probate court together with every binder from the archive. My father suddenly lunged toward the documents, but courthouse security entered before he reached the table. They restrained him as papers scattered across the floor. The relatives who had believed his version of the story for 16 years watched silently while the man they respected lost everything in a matter of seconds. Outside the conference room, my mother asked if we could speak privately. She admitted she had always been afraid of my father and claimed fear had kept her quiet all those years. I listened without interrupting, remembering the rainy afternoon when she stood comfortably beneath an umbrella while I watched my entire life disappear. Finally told her that fear might explain silence, but it could never erase 16 years of choosing to protect a thief instead of a child. She reached for my hand, but I stepped away. That was the last conversation we ever had. The investigations that followed uncovered forgery, financial fraud, and years of deception hidden beneath respectable appearances. Business partners disappeared, family members stopped defending him, and every lie he had built his reputation upon collapsed under the weight of documented evidence. Watching his downfall brought me satisfaction, but it was never the greatest victory. The greatest victory belonged to Aunt Evelyn, whose patience and courage ensured the truth survived long after she was gone. Several months later, I reopened her townhouse as the permanent headquarters of our family scholarship foundation. The first recipient was a 14-year-old girl escaping an unsafe home with nowhere else to go. Her scholarship covered housing, education, counseling, and legal support because I understood better than anyone that survival requires more than kindness. It requires opportunity. Every morning before beginning work, I glance at the small brass key displayed in a frame behind my desk. It reminds me that lies can survive for years, but truth only needs one undeniable moment to change everything. My parents believed they had thrown me away on a rainy afternoon 16 years earlier. They never imagined that one day I would be the person opening the door that finally allowed justice to walk in.